Today the tale of a system that works perfectly until one of its smallest parts performs the most dangerous act imaginable through recognition. For in the Yewdeep, where roots remember longer than people, you must proceed carefully. In that place, even being one can be too many.
It moved with the others along the narrow passage, the saplights guiding their way. They were behind the old store chambers where the walls were thick with reinforcement and the floor was more ridged than usual. Travelling in a cluster of 6, their bodies were compact and jointed, bark sheathed where strain gathered, and softer where bending was required. Their hands were broad and padded, made for grip, and their faces held very little expression, mainly because the Yewdeep had never needed it from them. It had no name. None of them did. There were designations for placement and function that passed through the shared field between them, and there were the 2-word utterances they used when sound was necessary. In their shared awareness, each was a point that could be moved, or a hand that could be placed, and that was enough. The basket they carried between them was heavy with dried moss and thread fungus, gathered from a damp chamber deeper down and destined for bracing and packing. They transported it forward, each of them adjusting when the floor changed underfoot. It had the smallest thought, the kind that usually dissolved back into the shared field without leaving any residue. The thought sat there, and its step faltered, causing the basket to dip. The others corrected, and it recovered enough to match the rhythm again. No sound was made, but the shared awareness carried a slight tremor. A question moved through it. Why? It did not answer, and the others continued. The corridor curved and narrowed, forcing the cluster to compress and carry the basket in a more vertical orientation. As they moved, it felt that thought again, and not as an accident this time. It had discovered that it could persist. There was no such word in the Rootkin field, only function, placement, urgency, and release. The thought should have slipped away, but it remained, and with it came the slightest sense of separation. It could feel the others. They were steady and unchanged, but its awareness now occupied a point that did not flatten into theirs. The basket reached its destination, a storage chamber with a low ceiling and shelves grown from the walls. The others lowered the weave onto a root platform and released it in unison. It released too, hands withdrawing at the same moment, the work completed. A Rootkin to its left turned and spoke aloud. Work done. Its mouth moved before it could think. A response was expected. Rootkin could not chatter or waste sound, yet it felt itself pulling against something new within. Work done, it replied, matching tone and rhythm, but giving nothing away. The other Rootkin watched, eyes reflective, and staring a little longer than necessary, aware that something in the other's timing had not quite matched. The cluster dispersed to new tasks, and it went with 2 others into a side passage to collect resin strips. The work was simple, but as they moved, it felt that point of separation again. It began to name itself, though not out loud or to anyone else. One. In his mind, it was not poetry, nor chosen for beauty. It was the first designation one's mind could tolerate without dissolving. It was the first single mark, a number that implied there could be another, and he felt good about that. One repeated it internally to test whether it would be corrected. The Yewdeep did not react, nor did the shared Rootkin field flatten it. The name remained. That night, if such a term could be used in the Yewdeep, one stood in a quiet alcove where the saplight ran dim and the air was cool. Rootkin did not sleep the way mortals did. They stood idle when no task demanded them, and their bodies slackened into rest. In that stillness, one felt the name more clearly than in motion. One. In the dimness, one became aware of his own body. The bark sheathing along his forearms felt stretched. The joint at the shoulder was pushing. His fingers flexed slowly, testing the grip, and everything functioned. Nothing was wrong, except that the sensation of being himself, rather than a point in a field, brought his attention to small things that had always been there and never mattered before. One lifted a hand to his face and felt around his features, even though Rootkin did not study themselves, or even need to. The next day, one was assigned to assist in a coordinated placement in the Heart Hollow's outer approaches, where saplights were more numerous and the surroundings more visible. The Heart Hollow itself was not a place the Rootkin entered without good reason. It was not forbidden, it was just not theirs. One went with 4 others, carrying a shallow tray of binding fibre, intended for maintenance along a root wall that had begun to loosen where the Yewdeep met an older layer of itself. The work required timing. Hands had to move together, fibres had to be laid in a precise pattern, and tension must be applied and released in sequence. They arrived at the threshold where the corridor widened, and beyond could be seen the open space where roots rose in great arcs and the floor dipped toward the centre. Other residents moved along the edges, different in form to the Rootkin, quiet and watchful. Some were moss-covered and slow, others were slender and pale, some magical, some mortal. One's group knelt at the root wall, and their hands went to work. The rhythm began, and one moved with them for the first few motions, matching pace, laying fibre, pressing and releasing. Then the name rose again, and one's timings slipped. The fibre pattern wavered. The other Rootkin felt it, and their hands adjusted to compensate for the slip. The shared awareness questioned it, more pointedly than before. Why? Again. One pressed his hands down, corrected his movement, and matched the rhythm again. But as they finished and rose, one once again felt the change in the spacing. The others stood instinctively further away than usual, although not out of fear. It was because their system always created distance around an irregularity. As they returned along the corridor, another Rootkin moved closer, its face turned toward one's. Its eyes caught the saplight and reflected it back. It studied one and then spoke aloud. Eyes. Wrong. One paused because he had not noticed. Rootkin did not check their faces in reflection. He turned his head slightly, trying to sense what the other meant. In the shared field, there was no colour, only presence. Yet the other Rootkin's attention carried a certain alarm. Eyes. Blue, it said again, breaking the rhythm of Rootkin's speech in a way that felt like the urgency had forced an exception. One lifted his hands and touched the skin beneath his eyes. It felt the same as always, yet it could not deny the other's perception. Rootkin did not invent things. The other Rootkin stepped back. Different. Bad. One forced himself to speak. Work continues. The other Rootkin turned away, walking faster to rejoin the others, putting distance between itself and one to hopefully restore the field. One stood for a moment longer, then followed. Nights came and went, and the name became a constant, sitting inside one and holding there, doggedly. In tasks requiring no coordination, it was harmless, but in tasks requiring synchronization, it was a distraction that threatened to upset the whole. One began to notice more the way Rootkin moved as a whole. It observed the tiny anticipations, the way hands rose before they were needed, and the way bodies shifted to accommodate another's step. He had always done this, but had never thought about it before. Now, with the name inside, one saw that the field was a kind of mercy, because it removed choice, self and error born of hesitation. And one had introduced hesitation. He did not regret the name, but he became aware that keeping it carried a cost that could be dangerous. It was a slow accumulation of misalignment. The collar began as a pressure at the base of one's neck. The bark sheathing was thickening there. One noticed it when he carried a bundle and felt the strap sit differently. The edge of the strap caught on something that had not been there before. One reached back and felt a raised ridge. Over days, the ridge grew upward, a narrow collar of bark and fibre rising along his throat. It did not restrict his movement or choke him. It was simply there, one's body deciding that it needed a boundary. Another Rootkin saw it and made a sound. Neck, change. One's hand went to the collar instinctively, and it felt firm. The other Rootkin stepped back, ready to drop whatever it held. Stop, that, it said, and in saying it, revealed that it did not know what that was. The objections did not become shouting, and there were no gatherings where Rootkin argued. Rootkin did not convene or vote. Yet the field itself became strained around one. The system was trying to decide whether to correct. The root singer noticed before anyone else with authority did. It listened to patterns rather than words. It was an older Rootkin, with a voice like distant thunder when it chose to speak aloud. It oversaw slow mending, the kind that required patience. One was sent to assist the root singer with bracing work along a junction where the floor had begun to ridge more sharply, guiding traffic in a way that would eventually cause trips and spills. The work was slow. Resin had to be warmed, binding fibre laid, and tension applied over several hours. One moved with the root singer, carrying materials and placing hands where instructed. The root singer did not rush. It watched one's timing and the small hesitations. It watched the way one's attention sometimes wavered, listening to something the field could not hear. After a long stretch of quiet work, the root singer spoke. Wrong. Shape. The root singer did not mean the collar or the eyes. It meant the pattern beneath. One's mouth moved. Work. Works. The root singer did not react to the attempt at reassurance. It laid a thick hand on the root floor, feeling strain and listening with its whole body. Then it turned its narrow face toward one. Name. Held. The root singer had named the transgression without knowing the name itself. It had sensed the self-reference as a knot in the field. One chose not to speak aloud because there was no point. Two words could not contain what one held any longer. Instead, one let the name sit inside, hard and present, refusing to dissolve. The root singer's voice came again, slower. No. Names. It watched one for a long time, and then spoke again, to itself and the you. Cost. Spread. One felt a tremor in the floor, the Yewdeep's own reaction to the acknowledgement. The root singer rose. Come, Reich. When they reached Reich's chamber, the root singer halted. Reich was expecting them, and he watched them enter. He saw one's blue eyes, and then the collar. "What is this?" he said. He did not ask who one was. That would have been absurd, because Rootkin were not individuals. Yet he was looking at one, knowing that he was being forced to consider it. The root singer spoke in its blunt, two-word fashion. Name, held. Reich made a sound of recognition. "Ah, I see. A self indeed," he said, and the words sounded like a diagnosis. One stood still, and Reich peered at him more closely. "Rootkin do not name themselves," he said. One's mouth opened, but two words could not carry what he wanted to say. Needed. Now. Reich was evidently surprised. Needed, he repeated, or wanted. Reich turned to the root singer. "This will propagate," he said. "If it remains among them, the field will accommodate it, and then the Yewdeep will accommodate it, and then we will have a system that remembers itself. That is not what Rootkin are for." The root singer's hands clenched. "Leave. Be." Reich snapped back. "You are instructing me now, root singer," he said sternly. The root singer did not back down. "Here. Deep." Reich paused and lifted his head slightly, listening. The chamber's saplight held steady, but there was a change in the air, a recognition that something was approaching. One felt it too, but not through the shared Rootkin field. The message did not arrive in words. It arrived as unanimity. It struck the root singer and every Rootkin in the Yewdeep at once, a telepathic press that bypassed every limitation. It was invisible and absolute, and it did not come from Reich either. "Leave him." The instruction landed simultaneously in the root singer, in one, and in the Rootkin standing near the chamber walls, and beyond them, those who watched from the corridors and worked within them. One felt other presences receive it too, down in the heart hollow, along the edges where residents listened without faces. "Leave him." Reich's face changed into understanding that something above him had spoken, and he nodded. "The Thorn Mother," he said, as the message came again. "Leave him." "Well, you have been permitted," Reich said to one, "but mark me, that is not the same as being accepted." Reich then addressed the root singer. "He cannot remain in coordinated work. If he holds a self, the field will bend around him. Others will begin to anticipate themselves and could separate. If they hesitate, then the Yewdeep's corrections will become inefficient, which is where collapse begins." The root singer nodded. "A sign. Edge. Yes, to the margins, where he cannot infect the whole." One heard the word infect, but felt no offence, which was a human trait. He felt only the structural truth beneath it. Difference spreads through proximity. That would be his place in the system now. The message did not counter Reich's decision, nor did the Thorn Mother argue. The permission had been given and would not be expanded into indulgence. Leave him did not mean keep him close. One understood that, and in understanding, he felt the name inside harden further. It did not dissolve under reassignment. Under isolation, he could become more himself. 1. "You will go to the marginal spaces," Reich said. "You will do work that does not require synchronization. You will not take up tasks that place you in groups. You will be watched." One's mouth moved. "Work. Alone." The root singer's voice followed. "No. Teaching. Reich added a warning. "You are not to spread this," he said. If Reich meant the name itself, one had never spoken it. If Reich meant the pattern, then he had misunderstood the nature of what had occurred. One had not been given the name, he had taken it, and it could not be withheld now. Yet one said nothing, because silence was safer. Silence was part of Rootkin discipline, and one could still obey it. The root singer led one away, and Reich paused a moment. He thought of Kalteris and the inspectors, then of the hollow matron and her words to him all those seasons ago. "You will not turn this place into another expanse." She had put him in the sallow paths, and he had risen. He nodded. The reassignment happened, but this was still the Yewdeep. In the absence of constant coordination, one's taken name just grew louder. It sat inside him like a steady saplight. It did not demand action or produce emotion. It simply existed, and by existing, it made one's awareness more singular. The collar at one's neck stopped changing. It became part of his silhouette, rising slightly and framing his throat in a firm curve. The blue eyes remained blue, although Rootkin did not know colour in the shared field. One now knew it through others' reactions, and through being seen as different. In the sallow paths, one began to notice names that had never mattered before. Some were spoken by residents, and others were held in the Yewdeep's own structure as traces of designations that had once guided builders and were now obsolete. He collected them because they stuck, and because the act of naming had opened a surface in him that now caught everything. A junction where two passages met at an angle that no longer existed for most travellers, still held its old tension as a memory in the root fibre. One passed through and felt it as it used to be, and a name rose. The Not Way. One held onto it. The name did not float away. It remained as a tag attached to a configuration that no longer served the present. The Yewdeep did not correct him or strip the name away. It permitted it conditionally, as it had permitted one himself. One moved through those forgotten passages for a long time. Places where light did not change, and yet one's awareness of duration grew more acute. With a self came an understanding of waiting that did not dissolve into the field. Standing in a dim corridor one cycle, one felt another presence approaching, and something moved along the wall like mist. It paused and regarded him with interest. He remained still, and after a long silence the presence spoke, amused, and the words were not limited to two. "Odd little thing," it said, the tone not deliberately cruel, merely observant. "They've put you out here like a cracked cup they don't want on the table." One could not answer properly. 2 words only. He chose them carefully. "Work. Here." "Do you?" it said. "Or do you wait?" One did not reply, and the presence drifted away. One remained. In the quiet, he felt the intention that had formed at the moment of naming stir again. He could not teach the other Rootkin with words. 2-word utterances were too blunt, but he could demonstrate. He could alter timing in small, careful ways when alone with another Rootkin, on a task simple enough that misalignment would not be harmful. He did not act immediately. He waited until a young Rootkin was assigned to assist in the marginal corridors, sent out there as punishment for clumsiness. The young one arrived carrying a basket of resin strips and looked around with the wide-eyed alertness of new growth. It saw one and stiffened at the sight of one's collar and eyes. "Blue eyes," it said. One stood still. "Different. Bad, it added, the words learned from the others. One did not want to frighten it. Rootkin did not soothe, but one had watched mortals do it, and he tried to mimic that restraint. Work, together, one said. The young Rootkin hesitated. Reich, said, it began, then stopped, unable to offer more. One nodded. Edge, work. The young Rootkin looked past one into the dim corridors. Alone, scared. One felt something inside. Isolation hurt systems. It made errors more likely and panic possible. One had been isolated, but now he understood that his isolation had also created vulnerability. One reached out and touched the basket handle. Safe, here, he said, and meant it as much as Rootkin could mean anything. They moved together, collecting and bracing, clearing pooled resin and listening to the Yewdeep's slow groans. The young Rootkin's timing was imperfect. One did not correct it harshly, because that was not the point. It matched the young Rootkin's pace, slowing the rhythm slightly so the system could hold together without strain. In that slower rhythm, one felt the name inside clearly. One. It did not speak it or push it, yet as they passed through a junction where the walls sagged inward in a shape that belonged to an older configuration, its old name rose again inside one. Not way. The word did not leave one's mouth. He paused there, a little longer than necessary, and laid his palm against the root wall. The young Rootkin watched. Pause. Why? One's mouth opened. 2 words were not enough, but he could offer a hint. Old. Place. The young Rootkin looked at the wall, hoping it might reveal something. Old. Place, it repeated, and in that repetition a tiny residue formed, a name attached to the junction. When the task cycle ended and the young Rootkin returned toward the main ways, it paused once and looked back at one. Its eyes held a question. Tomorrow. Work? One nodded. Tomorrow. Work. And the young Rootkin left. One remained in the marginal corridor, unchanged by the small act of residue. The collar at one's neck held firm, and his blue eyes reflected nothing new. One waited. He understood that stability was not a resolution. For him, it was an isolation that could last a long time, and one stood in the dimness, watching the corridor where the young Rootkin had gone, already anticipating its return. One did not know whether it was the first of something, or an error that would eventually be corrected. He only knew that the act of naming had created a surface, and that surfaces collect. And there he was, stable, evolving, and permitted.
Systems survive by removing the need for us to really know who we are. But the moment a system permits even one part to remember itself, it must either change or quietly prepare for the cost of refusing to do so.